Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. It is a wonderful privilege to have this time with you. And what we'll be doing over the next hour to an hour and a half is talking a little bit about research, how we conduct research, and how we think about research in terms of ethical issues that may arise in the planning and the conduct of research studies. I know that many of you will be sort of connecting and may have bandwidth issues, so don't feel obliged to switch videos on and things like that. But for those of you who can, it would be lovely to see some of you, because what I want to do is try and keep this as conversational as possible. I'm sure you don't want to just listen to me for the next 60 to 90 minutes or so. So yeah, do put video as you can. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who aren't asking questions or aren't inputting. Do keep your microphones off, just to help others hear sort of the session more clearly. I understand that we are recording the session, so don't worry if you do need to step away, rejoin, there will be a recording. And I'm happy to share the slides, so I will email those on, so don't feel like you need to furiously take notes. And then if there's additional reading, additional case studies you would like, then feel free to email either of us and I can send more resources. Again, this is very much a session for us to connect and for you to see that you have a resource when it comes to questions and processes about research ethics. So feel free to use this just as a start, not sort of that we have to cover everything in this session. I do have slides, and I'm awful at tech, so forgive me if this takes me a little bit longer. I'm hoping you can see the slides now. Okay, yes. Brilliant. The thing is, I'm not going to be able to see hands go up once I start presenting. So if anybody does have questions and things, do just holler, unmute your microphones and just speak up so I can hear you. The session is going to predominantly be about research ethics. And some of you may be wondering what research ethics is. And it'd be lovely if you can populate the chat with any initial ideas about what research ethics is, why it's important, and any experience any of you have had in thinking about research ethics. The other is, it'd be lovely for me to know who you are. So are you a medical student? Are you a junior doctor, or someone who's done medical research? Do just put things in the chat so we can get a little bit of an idea of who's in the room. I'll give you a little bit of a historical backdrop. So many of you will know that since the start of human civilizations, there's always been an interest in healing practices, herbs, medicinal products that can help with wound healing, ailments, coughs and colds. And so there's been informal ways of testing novel therapies since we have documents on these things. Having said that, there have been questions, concerns about the ethical ways, the right ways in which we should be doing this involving humans since, centuries ago. Since the time of the Greeks and the Romans, even Ibn Sina or Avicenna, the Persian Muslim polymath, wrote about what it means to do experiments on humans and how animal trials aren't sufficient. So we have some some engagement, some documentation with questions around research ethics since then, but the field itself is a relatively new one. It's only since the Second World War, when the world became aware of the Nazi experiments, particularly on vulnerable populations, that the medical community became very, very worried about the role of doctors in particular in conducting research on participants without their permission, without their consent. And this led to the authorship of the Declaration of Helsinki. What's incredible is the Declaration of Helsinki is still ongoing. So they're doing a complete a revision of it now. And for those of you who are interested, I can keep you posted on that process. In fact, they're engaging with medical students too, in terms of what should and shouldn't be in that document going forwards. And although it's not law, there's very little legislation in this space. Many countries, many research institutions, collaborators, funders use the Declaration of Helsinki as their guide for how medical research should be conducted. After the authorship of the Declaration of Helsinki, there was another report that was drafted, the Belmont Report, which had many authors, including Beecham and Childress, who some of you may have heard of, because they developed the four principles of medical ethics, namely autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And we'll talk a little bit more about the four principles as this conversation develops. Why else should we be thinking about research ethics? There is this historical backdrop, which is incredibly important for us to consider. And I will talk a little bit more about that historical backdrop, particularly things that have happened in the US at the same time that there was scrutiny on what was happening in Europe. But one of the other reasons why research ethics as a field is important is because of ongoing concerns about misconduct. So there's been many reports in scientific journals about the fatal consequences of research trials and potentially even their suitability. Some of you may have heard about Facebook breaching what was considered ethical guidelines because of the sorts of studies they ran on their users. There've been my experience is predominantly in the UK, though I do have some experience in Asia and the Middle East for conducting research, but also providing ethics training. But a lot of the work that's been done in the UK has been as a result of participants under experiencing a lot of undue harm because of research, and that's led to this commitment to try and make sure there's guidance but also governance around how research is conducted. Okay, I'm just going to stop there briefly just to make sure that everybody is following so far. I'm also going to look at the chat. Lovely to see who's in the room. Lots of medical students at different stages. Aya, congratulations, Mabruk, that you graduated this year. Fabulous news. For those of you who are using the chat function, it'd be lovely to know, do any of you have any experience of having conducted any research, either doing the research or being participants in research? I'll just leave that question open. So yeah, the next thing that would be helpful to know is if anybody has experience either doing or participating in research. And it doesn't need to be some global collaborative study. I mean, I don't think any of us in the room have that experience, but even if it's something very simple, where you interviewed some people or tests were taken, it'd be really good to hear more about that. Okay, Ala, great. Siham, Duha, do any of you want to unmute your microphones to tell us a little bit about the research that you did? Anybody want to go first? So Siham, you've told us that you've participated in lots of research projects. Either if you're able to unmute your microphone, or even if you're able to just use the chat function to tell us a little bit about the studies themselves. And was there anything about the study that you thought, I'm not sure about that, or why did they do this and why didn't they do that? Do just use the chat function for that. Um, the rest of you do just keep populating the chat function so we can know more about the experiences that you all share and the expertise that you have within the group. I'll let that chat function flow. Not now, Zoom. Okay, so that's a little bit of a preamble about why we should be thinking about research ethics to try and mitigate harms to participants, but also taking a step back in terms of the historical backdrop and development of research ethics as a field. And what I would say is, although it's now a recognized part of medical research, it's still very, very much in its early stages. And for those of you who are keen on taking up part of medical research and practice that is still in development, where you can have a significant role in shaping things, I would say research ethics is a really good one to go for. So if any of you are interested in projects, in writing things about this, in thinking through experience you've already had, then do let me know. It would be really great to work together on ideas, however early in their stages, together. So one of the key things about planning a research study and thinking about research ethics is this issue of the different stages at which you're going to be planning for the research. So for those of you who've either conducted research or are planning to conduct the research, you need to be thinking, well, at the ground level, have we done the following? Have we thought about the participants that we want to be involving? And have we sought their permission for the study that we're doing? The other is, based off of the study that you're doing, have you described the risks and benefits clearly? So those two seem like separate issues, but they're actually very, very intertwined. So when we're seeking permission, or when we're trying to get consent from participants, it's incredibly important that we're very candid, we're very open and honest about what the research entails, what the processes are. Will they need to have blood samples taken? Will they need to come into a clinic? Will someone visit them in their home? How often will the tests take place? If there's an intervention, what do we know about the intervention? What do we know about the harms, the potential benefits? All of those sorts of things you need to be providing in an information sheet, but also giving time for the participants to ask questions, get information, so they can be fully informed. And the reason for this mandate of consent is that there's a huge importance in us respecting an individual's bodily integrity. That they should be deciding what is done to them, by whom, and when. And that's why consent is critically important. So a lot of you may have come across it as a procedural thing. We have to do this as part of the research, but it's also important to recognize why it's important in order for you to be able to interrogate whether your consent processes are sufficient. The other is that you need to think very, very carefully about this before you submit ethics applications for a research ethics committee, because the committee will be interested in the type of study or studies that you're doing, what that means for participants, and whether you've really thought through this process of receiving permission, but also this question of benefits and harms. The other thing that I'd love to know in the chat is whether any of you have had any exposure to ethics committees, either submitting a research proposal or being on an ethics committee or observing an ethics committee. And again, if any of you are interested in doing any one of those things, do let me know. We do have a few ethics committees in Oxford, and they're always open to observers. And so if any one of you would like to do that kind of thing, do let me know. The chairs of those committees are, really, really welcoming of medical students and doctors alike. The second layer that we need to be thinking about when we're planning for research is broader concerns. And these are issues around whether the research activity should be taking place at all. An example of this could be a lot of work is done a lot of research is done in sub-Saharan Africa, and many people have been questioning the type of research that's done in those settings, particularly if there's going to be no benefit to the participants and no benefit to that population. So say, for example, you're working in a part of the world where most disease is caused by infectious diseases, and most of those are either diarrheal diseases or malaria in children. And the study that's being done is for cholesterol lowering drugs. Of course, there may be some benefit because there's an increase in non-infectious diseases in all parts of the world. But one of the ethical questions you may want to be asking is, well, why are we doing this study here? Is this the sort of question, the sort of issue that's important to communities here? And the other question that you need to be thinking about is the trial ethically justifiable in the way that it's proposed? Now, this is a really, really important question, particularly when it comes to placebo-controlled trials. So some research funders and research institutions have been scrutinized because they've ran placebo-controlled trials in parts of the world when there are standard therapies elsewhere, so in Europe or in America. I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. So say you want to trial a new cholesterol-lowering drug, and you want to have a significant result. The N value, so the number of people you'd need to recruit in the study, would have to be much higher if you're using a standard therapy as well as the new therapy, in order for you to be able to illustrate the difference, the difference in the cholesterol level at different points in the study. Whereas if you use a placebo arm, it's more likely that you'll be able to illustrate effectiveness of your drug with a much lower N value, much fewer participants. And the reason why this may be considered important by funders and research institutions is it's cheaper, it's faster. Now, the ethical question for us is this the right thing? So even if parts of the world don't have standard therapy, is it right for us to conduct a research study with a placebo-controlled arm when in other parts of the world or in the funding country, you wouldn't do that? So is it ethically correct to have different different ways of doing things in different parts of the world? I'm just going to put that question out there, and it would be great if anybody had any thoughts, any questions, any comments about that. If you need me to repeat the question, do let me know. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up the Zoom thing so I can see what's happening in the chat. Oh, Siham, thank you so much. No, don't worry about the microphone. You about geriatric medicine amongst Palestinian physicians. That sounds like a really, really valuable study, and it was a cross-sectional study. That sounds incredible. It must have been. I'd love to read that paper if you could share it with me. And some of the questions I have about that kind of study, Siham, is what was it like conducting that study amongst a geriatric population? So was there an age range? What was your inclusion and exclusion criteria? Was it individuals over a particular age, or was it comorbidities based? Was it about the types of conditions that they had? And what was it like obtaining consent from that population? Sometimes there is a worry about the prevalence of confusion, states of altered consciousness, potentially early stages of dementia. And so if there's a concern about capacity in that sort of cohort, then how did you manage that in the research that you were doing? Or were you only conducting research or enrolling people who had capacity, i.e., not those who may have been acutely confused or had any diagnosis of dementia? So those are just a few questions, that I'd be interested in knowing about, but also that an ethics committee may be thinking about when looking at a proposal of that kind. Maysan, you're saying that you did a collaborative study on the effect of crowd control weapons on the mental health. That's an incredibly important study, and you interviewed doctors and transcribed those interviews. And it'd be really, really valuable to know from you, what were the ethical considerations that you thought about going into the study, but also any novel ethical issues that emerged when you were conducting the research. And it's an incredibly difficult study to do, and it must have been very, very hard conducting those interviews. So did you have concerns about the safety, the safeguarding of interviewees? And was there any resource to, either think about that and plan for that as part of the study? Duha, you did interviews with head teachers about the education system. That's an incredibly important study. Was there any concern the participants had about their information remaining confidential? Because this is something that they may be sharing sensitive information about either their individual school or the education system at large. Was there any concerns, any anxieties about confidentiality, and how did you maintain confidentiality in that setting? It'd be really good to know more about that. Someone's just asked for my email address. What I'm going to do is just put it in there for everyone, so you all have it to hand. It's all lowercase. So yeah, please feel free to email me if you're interested in any part of what I've shared, / want to know more about research ethics, want to do projects, etc. I'll just go back to the question about whether or not you think we should be using the same ethical guidance, the same principles across the board, or whether it's justifiable for different guidelines and different processes to be used in different parts of the world. So if a country doesn't have a cholesterol lowering drug at all, can we do a placebo controlled trial in that setting, or should we still be using standard therapy alongside the new drug that you want to be trialing? Brilliant. I will carry on. Keep populating the chat with your research experience, but also ethical issues that you feel have cropped up in the research that you've done or that you've participated in. So this is a little bit about the material that we'll cover. It seems like a lot, but don't worry, we will be going through it at a steady pace. And if we run out of time, don't worry, I will share the slides with you. And if any of you want to have one-to-one chats, or offshoot groups as a follow-up to this, either to discuss the cases a little bit more or the theory a little bit more, do let me know. Very, very happy to do that. So I just wanted to start by illustrating, sort of the complexities around consent, but also this mandate for generating medical knowledge with a case study. So some of you may be asking, well, look, medical research is really, really important. We need to be generating knowledge about diseases, about treatments, and surely that is so crucial. That's a justification enough for really pushing ahead with research. And that's important to consider, but I think we need to consider sort of the balance or the trade-offs that we may encounter. And this trial is a really good example of that. And it was about questioning what the standard of care was when somebody's heart stops. And normally in those sorts of situations, paramedics would administer adrenaline, but there was some evidence that suggested that adrenaline in those sorts of settings may be ineffective or even harmful. So what we're arriving at in this situation of generating new medical knowledge or encountering new knowledge is something that's called clinical equipoise. We have sufficient uncertainty within our medical paradigm where we don't know whether one thing is better than the other, where it's critically important for us to be doing research about this. So that's one justification for this process. But the next question is a critical one, which is, how do we do research of this kind? So if we're getting a patient who's unconscious, their heart stopped, how do we justify conducting research or giving them adrenaline or not giving them adrenaline? How do we do this without their permission? And so the people who are proposing this study said, well, look, the way in which we can make this fairer is by randomizing the participants. We're not prejudicing anyone by saying, well, look, we're going to give you adrenaline, but we're not going to give you adrenaline. We'll randomize so we don't know who's going to get adrenaline or not. And half of the participants will get the adrenaline and half of the participants will get a placebo. And there was a lot of discussion within clinical journals such as the BMA, but also ethics journals about this trial. Some of the medical community said, well, look, it's really, really problematic for patients not to know what you're going to be giving them, i.e. you're doing this study on unconscious people and it's wrong for that reason. Other people said, well, look, how are we going to know which is better, adrenaline or not? And on that basis, this ethical concern has been totally blown out of proportion. We should seriously think about generating this type of knowledge because it's not only going to benefit these patients, it's going to benefit many, many patients beyond this trial. So a question for you is, if you're sitting on an ethics committee and you've been tasked with re-evaluating the ethics of this research, would you defend the research? So do you think it's okay for us to run this research on unconscious patients? I'm just going to pause there so we can see some responses in the chat. What do you think? Anybody want to brave an answer? And look, I'll give you a clue. There isn't just one answer. And in this space, it's actually very, very difficult to come up with a wrong answer. So anybody wants to try and pitch in, would you consider conducting research without patients' permission when they're unconscious acceptable? Okay, so Noor's saying it's like the trolley problem. Duha saying definitely not, as is Dalia. Duha, Dalia, can you tell us a little bit, just one sentence or two, why is it unacceptable? Why do you think it's wrong? And is there anyone in the room who wants to play devil's advocate? Anybody think, hang on a second, we're missing a trick here. This is, okay, it's not perfect, but it's okay. Excellent. Okay, so Salma's raising a really, really good issue for us, which is, are there alternatives? Why are we doing this in unconscious patients when there may potentially be an alternative for us to be able to do this clinical equipoise, this uncertainty? And so if we can do it on cell models, animal models, then that should be our go-to. Some of what I would say is um, a potential counter argument to that is, even when we conduct those trials, it's very, very difficult to know what the outcomes would be in humans. And so if you're faced with that sort of counter argument, what would your response be to that? So this is an illustration of how you develop an ethical argument. You have your position, you have your reason for it, which you've done really well, Salma. And then what you need to then think about is, well, if somebody disagrees with me, what would they say? And how would I respond to that? So that all together helps you develop an ethical argument. So if anybody wants to brave producing a counter argument, and there's lots of counter arguments to what I've pitched, then do put it into the chat. Dalia, you've said, yeah, very good, very good. So there's a problem with us not having sought prior permission. Now, can you foresee problems with this? We would need to know that a person's heart's going to stop in order for us to get prior permission. And in most cases, we're not going to know that. So that could make that sort of thing logistically impossible. But you're absolutely right. In other situations where we can front load that consenting process, that would be a way around it. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing your name right. It's lovely. I've never come across this name before, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Orjuan, you've said because they trust us with our lives and we can't put them at risk just to test a hypothesis. I think that's probably one of the most important reasons for us to think about this very, very carefully. One of the reasons why clinical ethics, research ethics is so critically important for us to upraise and implement carefully is in the clinical setting, patients bear their bodies, their intimate selves to us. They trust us with their lives. And so it's critically important that we not just maintain that trust, but continue to build that trust. And this possibility of doing things on people without their permission, also that could potentially be harmful, that could raise significant concerns, may not only just be a problem for that individual, but may raise questions about the medical profession more broadly. So if we became aware of something like this, we'd not trust the healthcare institution as much. So yeah, that's an important one. Siham, yeah. Oh, I like this. This is a really good idea. So some of you are now getting into this terrain of not just saying, well, look, this is a problem, but you're coming up with novel solutions. So Siham's novel solution is, well, look, if we can't get consent from the individual, then we should get proxy consent from a significant other. So the reason why this is also unacceptable is we're not even getting consent from someone who could be consenting for the patient on their behalf. Brilliant. And you will see this, that ethics committees pose these sorts of challenges on researchers, research institutions, research funders. And so they need to be thinking about how they mitigate these sorts of ethical concerns. And the sorts of novel solutions you guys are raising is exactly the way in which you can do this. You guys will make a brilliant ethics committee, by the way. And what you can see from this is when you're thinking about the ethical questions, it's not only helping you to solve the ethical problems, but it's also helping you to strengthen the research itself. Really helping you to think about how you're going to conduct the study and why. Yeah, good, Noor. Echoing that, that's brilliant. Yeah, good. So Yaman, you're helping us to think about sort of the opposite side, which is if participants or their representatives were properly informed about the potential risks and benefits, and they provided a type of consent, then it would be okay. And I think that's a brilliant way for us to build off of what happened with these trials. So some of the potential solutions could be in a way that Yaman has said, which is what you can do is oops, where have I gone? What you can do is let people know more broadly about the study and give them an opportunity to opt out. And if they don't opt out, then you can consider it implied consent, that they know about the study and they want to participate. Some of you have a think about what the possible problems of that could be. Um, and some of those concerns may be the feasibility. How can you guarantee everybody has heard about this? So for the Paramedic 2 trial, there was this suggestion that the public would know about the study, and anybody who didn't want to be in the study would be wearing a bracelet. And that way the paramedics would know that they don't want to be enrolled in the study, and that would be a way for them to opt out. And this sort of thing has been trialed in different parts of the world successfully, but some of the problems you may find is it may be infeasible for different contexts, or depending on the study itself. And is it really consent? If people haven't read or heard about the trial, then there may be a whole cohort of people who haven't consented, and you're inappropriately enrolling them into the trial. The other is you're potentially getting people to consent to something that's so far removed from when it actually matters. And so this might be a problem. And then the other is, well, opting out is not really consent. And so you're still conducting research without consent, which is a problem. The other solution you may have around this is emphasizing the social utility of the evidence that you're generating. And you're emphasizing that it's incredibly important, valuable, and it resolves the uncertainty. So one way or another, we're going to know whether adrenaline is helpful in this context or not. The problem with that is that the individuals who are being enrolled into the study are having to bear the risk for other people's benefit potentially. Is that fair? And that's something you may want to be thinking about even more broadly when we're thinking about research and why it's important. Other questions some of you may have been asking through this conversation is, under what conditions is it ethical to withhold standard care? When is a placebo control ethically permissible? Is research ethical in the absence of informed consent? And what ethical problems are generated with sick or vulnerable populations? So, after this session, if it's helpful, do have conversations with colleagues, friends, family about these sorts of things. And if things crop up that are unresolved, do let me know, and I'd be happy to cover off any follow-up questions. Let's go on to section 2, which is, and you'll think it's a curious order in which we're covering this. Why aren't we thinking about what research is before we're thinking about the ethics of research? I think some of it is about a lot of this being intuitive to you all, and clearly you all have some experience of research, but also grappling with this issue of, hang on, it's dodgy if we're doing research on people who are unconscious without their permission. How can we get proxy consent from other people? How can we try and front load the consent before the situation arises? But let's now have a think about how we define research. And research is different to audit. It's different to projects that you may have done in isolation that are very, very localized. Research is defined as a systematic investigation that aims to produce generalizable knowledge. So systematic investigation is one where it's methodologically robust, which means it can be repeated to duplicate findings or to verify findings. And the other is that you're going to be producing the knowledge in a way that is going to be generalizable, i.e., it's not so specific, it will be applicable to other places, other people. And we also want to be thinking about what the difference is between clinical ethics and research ethics. So clinical ethics broadly is about dilemmas, challenges, trade-offs that arise in determining the interests of your individual patients, the person in front of you in your clinic or on your ward. Whereas research ethics is much, much broader than that. Where you're thinking about not just the individual patient, but your participants and their interests, and balancing that with generating medical knowledge. So you have this whole commitment to medical science that needs to be considered alongside this cohort or this individual that you're recruiting. I'm seeing things happening in the chat, so I'm just going to have a look. Good. Okay, Mohammed, really, really good point. So you're flagging here residual ethical concerns. So even if we take consent from a proxy, what happens after when the patient regains consciousness and they're like, look, you committed battery, i.e., you did something to me without my permission, and I don't accept this. And you're absolutely right to flag this. The researchers and funders may be liable for a legal case in that sort of setting. And again, this is why thinking through the ethics and the legality before conducting research is so important. Noor, you're saying that you could be legally protected, potentially. I think it depends what procedures you undergo to make sure you've had sufficient engagement on this. So this is why some research ethics committees may have lay representatives to get their view on what it is researchers are proposing and why. Some research ethics committees may say to researchers, look, you need to get formal legal advice. We're not a legal authority, and so go away and get legal advice on XYZ issues and then come back to us so we can see what the legal team have proposed also. So I think all really, really important points from you all. Dalia, good question. What I mean by proxy consent is you're not getting consent from the individual person, you're getting consent from their family member, their spouse, someone they may have appointed as an individual who can give consent on their behalf. I hope that's clear. If it isn't, then do just put a follow-up question into the chat. Very good point, Doha. So this really cropped up during the acute stages of the COVID pandemic. Excellent, Dalia. I'm glad that's clear. This issue that maybe we're thinking too much about protecting participants and their interests. We need to make room for people making altruistic decisions, i.e., they want to participate in research that could potentially be harmful, that could potentially be risky, but because it's either something that could be of benefit to them or benefit to others, we should allow for that. A question to all of you: what do you all think about Duha's proposal? Should we allow people to participate in risky research if they provide their consent? What do we think about that? In the interim, yeah, Siham, you're absolutely right. When a person consents to research, they're not then bound throughout. One of the critical things when we're thinking about what valid consent is to also enable people to withdraw at any point. You're absolutely right. So yeah, come on, team. I think Doha's given us a really juicy question. My son is like, even though it sounds bad, most valuable medical info has been obtained in such ways. Um, it's an important question for us to ask, how has medical knowledge been generated in the past and even in the present, and whose bodies are on the line? Are there people who are having to carry an undue burden of risk for the rest of us to benefit? Mariam, you're saying you have to look at the risk and benefits. And I think that's really, really important. Just because someone may consent to something, it doesn't absolve us of this responsibility of making sure that we're mitigating the risks as far as possible. Brilliant, team. I think you've done a terrific job of that. Um, so there are some things that we need to be considering from the perspective of medical researchers as well as doctors. Research ethics isn't just in the purview of the researchers themselves. Of course, researchers need to be thinking about ethical questions of the design and conduct of the study itself, as well as ethics review. But doctors need to also consider very, very carefully when they're advising patients considering research enrollment. So for those of you, some of you may be thinking, well, look, this is all well and good, but I haven't conducted any research, nor am I planning to. My answer to that would be you will still be in your practice encountering situations where you will need to advise your patients about research enrollment. So it may be in dire circumstances, for example, in oncology, where there isn't any standard therapy that may be beneficial to your patient, and it may be that the only option for them would be to enroll in a trial, and it could be that the trial isn't available in your clinic or your hospital, and they may need to travel. So they may be relying on you to know about the research, the study itself, and whether or not they should enroll. There may be instances in which you're not conducting the research itself, but you're being you're being sort of co-opted into recruitment, or recruitment is happening in your practice. And this is something that's incredibly important to consider, so that you're aware of what's going on, particularly for the patients that you look after. And then there'll of course be research on medical practice, part of not just governance, but systematic review of medical practice that you need to be aware of. Because medicine, as you all know, as juniors, it's a learning healthcare system. So there is this really important tension when you're thinking about your role as physicians, but also your role as potential researchers. And broadly, you'll know that the role of physicians is primarily to care and protect and promote the welfare interests of your patients. And some would say that it constitutes an undivided loyalty, that you should only be concerned about your your patients. Now, the clinical research is different because you're not just thinking about the individual patient, you're thinking about lots of the participants, but you're also thinking about future people. It isn't just risks and benefits of the person in front of you, but also what risks and what benefits may accrue from you conducting the research itself. And so this is why in clinical trials, you're randomizing, you're blinding, so not everybody will receive the intervention. Not everybody will know whether they're receiving the intervention or not. And you couldn't imagine this kind of thing happening in your clinical practice. So imagine if you are in a primary care setting, somebody comes in with fevers, what seems like an upper respiratory tract infection. You wouldn't say to that patient, oh, well, it could be this, it could be this. Let's trial this and this. No, you'd be making a very, very concerted effort to take a full history, examining them, doing the necessary bloods, an x-ray even to see if it's pneumonia. And based off of the evidence that you're collecting and your examination, you will be administering treatment and management that is based on evidence. In research, because there isn't a body of evidence, you're having to think about the knowledge that you're generating alongside the interests of participants. Yeah, so this is a question to you all. That can a physician fulfill obligations to patients and recommend trial enrollment? And controversially, there was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine which said, no, it's a circle you can never square. You can't be someone's clinician as well as think about research and enroll them into research. And so they said, we should abandon medical trials altogether. Question to you all, I mean, does that sound okay? What justifies exposing people to risk for the benefit of others? And I'll pause there just to see what suggestions there are in the room. So how can we justify exposing some people to risk for the benefit of others? I guess, Siham, your suggestion for the previous question works well with this one, which is one of the ways in which we could justify it, is by looking at the risk and benefits. Mesan, really, really important point. It's only justified by consent. Okay, so Mesan, are you up for a tricky question? So my tricky question to you is, um, in, we know dementia is an increasing problem across the world, and we don't have treatment for dementia. There's only so much we can generate from biochemistry or from animal models. We seriously need to do research on humans. And if we're going to trial dementia drugs, one could argue that we should be trialing those drugs in patients who suffer from the disease. But if they suffer from the disease, then they may completely lack capacity, or capacity may be wavering. So, how do we justify enrolling patients with dementia for a dementia drug if we're saying consent is what's critical? Anybody have any suggestions, questions? Um, Dalia, you're saying this is the ultimate ethical dilemma. Um, yeah, I think that's a good point. So here's where we may want to also rely on novel solutions. And one of the ways is we shouldn't think about dementia as a diagnosis as one that's absolute, i.e., once a person has a dementia diagnosis, they lack capacity. Capacity is situation specific. And so it could be that eventually, once the disease becomes severe, they may lack capacity. But in their early stages, we may be able to tell them about studies that exist, and they may be able to consent on that basis. Some of you may say, well, look, they may consent 2 years prior, but when it comes to enrolling them into the study, they may refuse. What do we do about that? And there's a huge discussion and debate within the ethics literature, within the clinical literature about this. Some clinical colleagues and I wrote a paper on this where we looked at different case studies involving patients with dementia and looking at different situations. If some of you are interested, I can send you that paper. But the honest answer is, as Dalia has posed, is it's very, very difficult. And so although it sounds dissatisfying, at the end of this session, I don't want you to have this misconception that if we apply the 4 principles of medical ethics, or if we work through a specific guideline, there'll be an easy readout or an answer for what we do in situation X versus Y versus Z. What it requires is the sort of deliberation that we've been doing. So as researchers, as clinicians, you want to be thrashing out these sorts of questions to say, well, look, these are the ethical problems we'll be encountering. These are some of the solutions, but even when we apply these solutions, there are some residual ethical concerns, and being very transparent, very open about those, because it's through that transparency and honesty that we can then develop novel ethical solutions to problems. And so what we did in this paper is, first of all, say, well, look, we should be obtaining consent prior, but not only that, that even if a person lacks capacity, there's something really problematic about subjecting them to something that they are refusing. And so you do need to think again about trying to have that conversation with them, or with a significant other that they've given decision-making capabilities to. Oh, there's lots of things that's coming in. Oh, good. Yeah, Sihan, that's very, very, very good point. Selma, you're saying consent. They might, yeah, good point. Good point. We can justify doing research and risky research if it's going to benefit that population. So one of the reasons why we can justify doing dementia research in patients with dementia is it's something that would be of benefit to them. We shouldn't be doing a study on an asthma drug on patients with dementia if they don't have asthma and they're not likely to benefit. That's a really, really good way, Salma, to try and reduce the sorts of ethical concerns that we've been thinking about. Yeah, good. Siham, this is a really good point. We can imagine a future where the science literacy could be so much better in a population, but also their recognition of the social value of research, where they may say, actually, you know what? I volunteer for any and all types of studies at different stages in my life. And that doesn't mean they can't opt out of it at any point, but it completely alters how we're thinking about consent and the processes of consent, not just for individual studies, but at a population level. I really, really like that. I think that's, to be honest, I don't think enough has been said or written about that. I think that would make for like a really, really good paper, in what constitutes social responsibility and how we can tie consent to that potentially. I'm just going to have some water. Team, we're just getting to the hour mark. How are you all doing? Are you still okay? I'm not sure how much longer we have. How much longer do we have, Ramisa? Do we have another half an hour? I don't want to, overrun, but at the same time, I'm having loads of fun going through some of these questions and cases.
I mean, if you're happy to carry on, I think I'm finding it really interesting. Again, if any of the students have to leave, I think that's fine. But again, I think I'd like to hear the end of the talk.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's keep going for another half an hour or so, team, and then I think we'll try and break there, and then I'm happy to hang around for any questions and answers. So I think it's important at this stage, after an hour, to just take a little bit of stock. We've covered off what ethical issues are when we're thinking about research, but we're also thinking about what research is and how different it is to clinical practice, and how you need to balance your role as a clinician as well as this responsibility to generate knowledge. So some of you have started, to really think about this grid. So what justifies exposing subjects to risk? The first question is it necessary? So some of you said, well, look, is this something that's going to be of benefit to individuals? And is the risk reasonable? So, is the study the right way to generate this knowledge? And does that mean we can go ahead with the study? And then who should participate in the research and why? So, and this was that question about, if the participants are going to benefit, then that's one way of us justifying who gets enrolled and why. I won't go through this entire grid. It's very much there for you to have a look at. But for those of you who are planning research studies, it may be a helpful way for you to think about consent, when permission from participants is obtained, when the risk is limited, and when the options available are fair to all. So you can work through that grid, and you can see that it works alongside the four principles, the first being about consent, the second being about benefits and burdens, and the last being about justice. Okay, we've covered this. So I will skip that. We've inadvertently just had a go at that. Informed consent, some of you may know this already, which is that it's an ethical requirement. And the way in which you ensure that consent is sufficient is by covering off the necessary information giving. And this is through your consent forms, your information sheets, as well as the conversations that you'll be having with patients and participants prior to the research, but also during the research. The other is about voluntariness, so making sure that nobody's being coerced into the trial itself. And the last thing is about competence. Are they, do they have capacity to understand, communicate, retain, weigh up the information? The voluntariness question is a really, really important one and has been for a long time in medical research. There are trials that offer a lot of money for phase 1 trials, when we don't know whether a drug is safe or not. And some people have questioned whether an offer of that kind compromises consent. Question to all of you, what do you think? Do you think we should be paying participants to recognize the risk that they are carrying when enrolling into particularly phase 1 studies? And in order to recognize that risk, should we pay them? And if it's a lot of money, then is that something that's ethically justifiable? Actually, there's something about this case that we haven't covered, which I will go back to. Miriam, yeah, oh, that's a good answer. It depends on the patient's background. What do you mean? Give us an example. And whilst you're thinking about that, Miriam, what I'll say is let's just go back to, yeah, of course, please do. Yeah.
Okay, hi.
Hey.
Yeah, I think it depends on the patient background. So some patients may come from unfortunate group of people who didn't have enough of money, and they might get that disease or the procedure that we want to give that patient or that population of patients. And since they don't have a lot of money, they might volunteer for that trial since it will pay them a good amount of money, even though it would risk their lives.
Very, very good point, Miriam. So the two really important points you're making there, which is people who are socioeconomically sort of challenged, they may find any sort of monetary incentive too good to refuse. But then what that also means is the second point is that research of that kind, that risky kind, then only becomes, sort of, it then only attracts a certain cohort of people, which continues to perpetuate the sort of inequality that you're describing. It's a really, really good point. So when we're thinking about ethical solutions to that, we could maybe think about not making it a financial benefit. It could be a benefit in kind. And some of our students have also said, well, look, let's just change the way we conduct research altogether. That it shouldn't be about voluntary enrollment. It should be like other things that we do as part of our citizenship. So one of the students is like, well, look, it should be like a lottery. We should all carry equal risk. And or like jury service, everybody needs to serve on a jury or do certain things as part of being a citizen, and participating in medical research should be a similar thing. It'd be interesting to know what you all think about that. Mesan, you've said they should be paid because it's their time and their health. Yeah, good. So that's a justification for that. But after the research, okay, that's interesting. So yeah, how we're thinking about when we're giving the incentive and of what kind. Very good. Orjan, you're saying, look, this isn't about paying people to enroll, but if things go wrong, then you need to be thinking about compensating them for harms. And you're absolutely right. A lot of phase 1 trials in particular have to have that built in, and it's a legal requirement for them to have that built in. Really good point. No, yeah, that's a really good point. So incentives sometimes can be helpful just to get people to a point where they can know sufficiently about the study itself. Salma, well, an expert ethicist in the room, Salma, really good point. So you're making this point that, look, this isn't about incentives, but it's about reimbursing participants for their time. Because when people are enrolling in trials, they may need to travel to the clinic, they may need to take a day off work. And so lots of people have argued in a similar way that we should be paying people a day rate. We should be reimbursing them for their travel, and we should be paying them a little bit on top of that to appreciate them for enrolling into the trial. Yaman, but yes, you flagged what is the tricky thing here, which is if we pay them too much, it compromises voluntariness. And that's a really critical issue. And this debate is still rife. So for those of you who are interested in writing about this, do let me know, because we haven't solved it. So lots of research protocols just say, well, look, we're just going to pay people for travel. We're just going to pay people for the day rate. But then when you look at the risks involved, it seems unfair that participants aren't being appreciated on top of that. The other issue that arises in this sort of situation is, even when people are just being paid for their travel or their day rate, in parts of the world where people get paid very little or there's significant unemployment, research becomes very, very attractive as a form of employment. And it can lead to inequalities in communities, which is a broader ethical issue that then crops up. So when you're thinking about research and research ethics, it's of course about the participants and the trial itself, but you also need to be thinking about the negative unintended consequences that may arise as a result of the research that you're conducting. Brilliant team. I think you've done a fab job of this issue of voluntariness. Now we're just going to touch on a separate issue. What do you do in a situation like this, where the patient may not be getting the treatment, but they think that they will get the treatment and that's why they're enrolling? What do we do in situations like that? I'll just leave the chat up there, but I'll carry on going through stuff. So this is what's called therapeutic misconception. And you can see that this is something that will arise in the clinical setting, because when your patients who you've seen again and again come to your clinic, they're used to you being their doctor, they're used to you providing them with treatment. And on the day where you're trying to enroll them into a research study, they probably may think, well, look, doc, I've always trusted you with my care. I'm happy to do this. and I'm excited about getting benefit from this drug. And so they have this mistaken belief that the research procedure aims to benefit them. Now, the question to you all is, does this invalidate informed consent? And the way around that is we need to distinguish between whether or not the person truly misunderstands or whether there's just a misestimation. You know, they may think, oh, you know, that there's risks and benefits, but they've not quite understood. And then the last one is optimism, which is less of an ethical problem, where they understand everything that you've told them, but they're still hopeful that they will benefit. And you can see that 1 and 3 are very, very different, i.e. you'd worry about 1 and not 3. And in the first circumstance, what you may want to do, and this differentiates clinical practice to research, is spending a much longer period of time going through the process of the study, making sure that they understand what the risks and benefits are, what the process of randomization is, and blinding is, and that you may not know whether they're receiving the intervention and they may not know that they're receiving the intervention. And so you can see that therapeutic misconception, although it poses challenges to our consent process, it doesn't undo consent altogether. It just increases that information giving burden that we have in order for us to be able to ensure valid consent. So we're still sticking to those 3 things. Are they informed? Is it voluntary? Are they capacitous? But in the situation of therapeutic misconception, we're just having to work that much harder in a way that you wouldn't in clinical practice. Like, you will encounter situations where a patient may come with an exacerbation of their asthma and you're like, well, look, let's try this. And there's an implicit understanding from the patient that you've thought about all the evidence, you've thought about what will benefit them in particular, and on that basis they're like, okay, doc, happy to trial this for the next 3 months. Whereas that's very, very different to a circumstance like this, where the patient may or may not benefit, they may or may not be harmed. And in spite of that, they're saying, yeah, doc, this is great. I'm really happy. I'm so excited because this will make all the difference. And how you respond to that in order to mitigate that ethical concern about therapeutic misconception. Okay, team, let's make this our last case. I'll read this to you. Dr. Malone is a primary care doctor at a large research institutions. One of her patients, 20-year-old Charlie, was just diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The 5-year observed survival rate is 1%, and the current standard care is chemotherapy. The FDA has just approved, so this is the drug authority, has just approved a promising new drug called MX320 for clinical trials. A medical school classmate of Dr. Malone's is the primary investigator of an active control double-blind RCT of MX320. Early phase investigations suggest that the patients receiving the new drugs are improving. Based on this promising information, Dr. Malone thinks Charlie would probably be a good candidate for the drug. There's no guarantee that Charlie would be randomized to the experimental arm, but Dr. Malone and Charlie are hopeful. Charlie enrolls. After some weeks, he has shown no improvement, and Dr. Malone begins to wonder whether he's in fact in the randomized, he's been randomized to the control arm. Dr. Malone feels responsible for possibly giving his patient false hope. She's aware of another clinical trial from which Charlie might benefit and is unsure whether she should voice her suspicions to Charlie, which might prompt him to withdraw or keep her concerns to herself. So, team, what do you think about that? Oh, did I just stop sharing my screen? Oops, let me reshare. Put that up. Ooh. Okay, I'll leave that up there, and I'm going to give you all a couple of minutes to ponder that. What do you think about this? What should Dr. Malone? Yes, Mason, that's exactly the right reaction. It's like, oops. Let's see Let's see what others in the room think. Okay, so I agree. This is really, really hard. And in this case, you're seeing this real tension. Okay, Otran, you've said that, well, they should tell the patient because they have this additional responsibility because they're the ones who told them to enroll. So if if Charlie had enrolled already and then came to Dr. Malone and told them about the trial, what you're suggesting is that is a different responsibility. Maybe in that instance, Dr. Malone could tell them a bit about the research and the possibility of randomization. But because they're the ones who told them, they have this responsibility to let them know. Duha, really, really good point that maybe it's not all on Dr. Malone. Charlie is really struggling with the options that are available or not available, and they see that this trial is possibly the only way. And so Dr. Malone isn't doing anything wrong by suggesting something and providing them, even a slim opportunity of hope. Good, Yaman. I really like that. I really like that. Um, it's about not necessarily overstepping by telling Charlie to withdraw, but just being very, very open with them, saying, "Well, look, what do you think is going on? What did the leads of the research study tell you? What do you understand about randomization? What do you understand about the control arm versus the intervention arm?" And on that basis, seeing whether Charlie really understands and whether they're aware, whether Charlie may say, "Well, look, doc, it was worth a try. I think I may be in the control arm. Can you find out from me when they'll get data? So will they get to a point in the study where this treatment will become available for all of us?" And so that can happen as soon as equipoise or uncertainty is no longer there. Research ethics committees get research leads to constantly check their data, and it could be that that trial could end early, and that would mean it mitigates Dr. Malone's ethical concern, and Charlie could get access to the treatment earlier, especially if they were enrolled in the trial. It could be that the broader population may get the drug later, but they may give the drug to the control arm much earlier. So yeah, brilliant Yaman. Mariam, you're saying looking at the prognosis, yeah, good. Again, it's a really critical window, and so there's a problem with Dr. Malone not being candid, not being open. Yeah, good question, Maysan. We do need to be thinking about the risks and benefits. Mohammed, you're making a really important point, which is, as their clinician, Dr. Malone's primary responsibility is to the patient. They're not conducting this research. What they should be doing is thinking about the interests of the patient. I really, really like that. Yeah, good point, Siham. You're making us ask that methodological question, that not just randomization, but double blinding is critically important in order for us to generate significant results to prevent the possibility of clinicians facing this moral dilemma of, "Oh no, I think my patient is in this arm or that arm." Like, they really should suspend their judgment. It could be that they've got it wrong. It could be that Charlie is in the intervention arm, and that makes it all the more important for Dr. Malone not to interfere, so to speak. Team, really, really rich discussion on that case. I think that's been a helpful way of going through this issue of equipoise, which is a state of honest professional disagreement amongst a community of experts about the merits of various treatment options. And this is our justification for using placebo-controlled trials. You know, when we really don't know whether one thing is more beneficial than the other or more harmful than the other, that's our justification. But as soon as equipoise no longer applies, we need to think very, very carefully about whether a trial should continue in its existing form. Lots of questions about what we mean by equipoise, whose uncertainty. So is it about experts being uncertain, and what do we mean by experts, and what uncertainty are we thinking about? Is it the primary outcome, multiple outcomes? There needs to be clarity on that when you're using equipoise as the reason for placebo-controlled trials. That's a little bit more about equipoise, their team. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop there. And what I'll do is, share these cases with you. I'll share these slides with you. It's absolutely fine. But I do want to leave a little bit of time for you to ask questions, share any concerns. I know some of you were interested in knowing a little bit more about the process of planning for a study, applying for research ethics. Just on that, the first thing to say is being very, very robust, very rigorous about putting down the aims, the objectives, the methods, the primary outcomes, secondary outcomes of your study, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, to try and justify who's going to be enrolled and who's not going to be enrolled. And there are lots of guidelines out there. I would say look at the Declaration of Helsinki. If some of you want to have a copy of the sort of the tick list that we use in Oxford, I can share that with you. And what that goes through is, things like, are the consent processes adequate? What are the benefits? What are the burdens? Do participants get remunerated? What about confidentiality? So if it's data that you're collecting, then how are you going to collect that data? How are you going to anonymize it? How are you going to store it? If it's going to be transferred, how is that going to happen? And there's a whole corollary of resources out there. But if any of you are particularly concerned about a study that you are currently undertaking or planning for, then feel free to sort of reach out, email me. I'd be very, very happy to help in any way I can. Mehsan, you've said, what happens if a researcher is not ethical at all? Ooh, wow, juicy question to end the session with. Okay, so we haven't talked much about research misconduct, but Mehsan, you've done really well to hold my feet over the fire about that. Many of you will have come across in the global media, but also in journals, this issue of scientists publishing inaccurate results, fake results, or even conducting trials in an unethical way. More and more journals are requiring, particularly the prestigious journals, are requiring researchers to have ethics approval. So when you publish, oh, sorry, the text doing weird things. I'm doing lots of arm waving. So normally, so if you're submitting to something like the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, the BMJ, they will have a requirement, if you are conducting research on human subjects, to state very, very clearly where you've gained ethics approval from. And if it's a global collaboration, then you'll need to have multiple ethics approvals, from the local places that you're conducting the study, as well as the institution that is supporting the study. So in Oxford, for example, I'm a member of the research ethics committee here, and we require researchers to not just get ethics approval from us, but also from everywhere where the research is going to be conducted. And more published journals are being scrutinized for publishing research that breaches ethical standards, either in terms of safety of participants or in terms of the science itself. But I think, again, this is all of our responsibility. all of you who are now members of this community are not only responsible for your own research, but you are responsible for the conduct of research of others. And so it may fall on you to whistleblow, to be that person to write into a journal with a letter or with a counter a research finding where you say and scrutinize, hang on a second, this research that's been published on this particular drug is wrong because the researchers haven't done this, this, and this. So I hope it gives you a sense of there being systematic governance processes, but I think all of us need to buy into what it means to conduct good research, and sharing that responsibility. Yeah, absolutely, Mohammed. This happens all the time. And this is why research ethics committees are so important, because proposals get sent in and they get pushed back because they're unethical for all the sorts of reasons that you've been flagging, because their consent process isn't enough, because the incentives are too high or too little, or because they've excluded certain people, like they've excluded pregnant women from a research study, and there's no justification for why, especially if it's something that is going to affect pregnant people. Misan, you're most welcome. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for all of your input and your questions. Oh, see how I haven't watched this double blind. Oh, really? Okay, great. That's homework for me. Fabulous. The one that I would also recommend to you all is it's a fabulous book written by John le Carre. It's called The Constant Gardener, and it's also a movie. And honestly, it's the reason why I've spent so much of my life doing research ethics. It was absolutely harrowing when I read it as a medical student. So yeah, do watch that too, but do definitely watch Siham's one, I Will Be. In fact, there's lots and lots of movies and books that cover research ethics. So if any of you are interested in having a list, then please let me know. Mariam, you're most welcome. Noor also. Yeah, thank you all so much. I will stop talking there in case there are questions, comments, but lovely to meet you all. Inshallah, really looking forward to the possibility of us meeting in person, but also staying in touch. You know, do use the email address that I shared.
Thank you so much. I think we will let you go. It's coming up to 12:30 and you've given us an amazing talk. Yeah, I think we'll end it there.
No worries at all. Take care all. Ma salama.
Take care.